Hello everyone. So welcome to our third panel after lunch. I hope you all had a great lunch. And so we will follow up with our discussion on specifically with this panel, whose climate wars and security. And hopefully we will discuss climate change narratives through this panel. We will be having 4 panelists. One of the panelists is with us in live, but others will present online. Please kindly stick to 12 minutes limits so that we could have discussion following the panel. So thank you. So first, I would like to give floor to Grazia Pacillo, who is working for CGIAR. She's going to present CGIAR and its interdisciplinary approach to quality and how to qualify and quantify the climate security nexus. So Grazia, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Grazia Pacillo. I'm honored to be here with such a nice, very interdisciplinary group of people. So thank you very much for the invitation. I will be sharing my screen for my presentation. Please let me know if you have any issues in seeing my presentation. Okay. All right. So my name, as I said, is Grazia Pacillo. I'm senior economist and I work for the CGIAR FOCUS Climate Security. Here, a little bit of promotion on our website if you want to know more about our work. But essentially, this presentation will be about how we approach the study and the assessment of the climate security nexus. For those of you who don't know, CGIAR is a global partnership of about 12 to 15 research institutes working on tropical agriculture. Our aim is to reduce rural poverty, increase food security, and our mission is to end hunger by 2030 through science to transform food, land, and water systems in the climate crisis. As you see here, we are now calling ourselves One CGIAR because we're going through a process of restructuring, whereby all of these research centers are going to go under one umbrella called the CGIAR. And for that, we've been developing various research initiatives. Most of them are, of course, on climate, and we are very happy that the new research initiatives, climate security has taken a big place in most of these in many of these research initiatives across 6 main regions. Well, so why climate security? Well, we've been discussing this morning about the importance of security and the importance of climate crisis. Unfortunately, we live in a world where peace is not for granted anymore. And we know very well that without peace, there is no end to hunger. So our approach and our ambition to achieve SDGs, ending hunger by 2030, actually cannot happen if we don't tackle peace and security issues. And the numbers are clear. About 490 out of the 800 million people that are currently facing chronic food insecurities, and 74 out of the 110 million people that are facing acute hunger are located in only 21 countries affected by conflict and insecurities. And the world is becoming less and less peaceful as we speak. But from the Global Peace Index report 2021, we know that this year, the level of peacefulness have deteriorated for the 9th time in the past 13 years. So we must really address the issue of conflict and securities to actually achieve our SDGs. But what does climate have to do with all of this? Well, we know that climate really matters. We've seen in many studies and in many statements, and now climate is a threat multiplier. It really exacerbates risks and insecurities and socioeconomic systems that are at the root causes of conflict. What you see here is the results of our review of the evidences out there in terms of linking climate and conflict. And you see that climate change variability, the environmental drivers are a big source, a big driver of conflict, the instabilities. But of course, we know that there is no consensus in the literature about the direct impact of climate on conflict. What we know, what we hypothesize and we assume is that climate actually has an impact on conflict, but this impact is actually an indirect impact. It goes through several mechanisms and several channels and pathways that are at the basis that can increase the likelihood intensity of conflict. But going through, and this is not only something that we say or we find from the evidence, that there is a big consensus or the big acknowledgement in UN Security Councils. I mean, you know much better than us. I mean, the CGR, we work on land, water, and food systems, not so much of peace and security, but we have many resolutions. So the 2018 one was one of the very first ones. Then we have others and others and others. There has been recognition in the policy making agenda across international and national governments. You see the executive order here on from the White House, but also in Europe, in the German MFA as they declared that climate security will become very much part of their foreign policy. Similar sort of things from the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Irish Foreign Affairs. So for those of you who have followed the COP26, well, we had also this big fella here, and they promises this is not my grandfather, and I haven't talked to him. Is the Italian Prime Minister? I'm Italian, as you can tell. But he at the COP26, he was the one who actually said that climate is tearing us apart. That climate is connected to security. We must consider the climate security nexus if we want to achieve our ambitions for the climate, for climate mitigation, adaptation, but especially for our SDGs. And you name it. I mean, we have many international organizations that have been acknowledging the role of climate on peace and securities. The African Union, for instance, has adopted one of the most important communique in March 2021, acknowledging the role of climate on securities. And we have many other organizations, including the European Union institutions that are really becoming aware of this nexus. But so what does CGIAR have to do with all of this? As I said, our aim is to really end hunger by 2030, but our focus is on science, on land, water, and food system science in a climate crisis. Well, this is the question that we've been asking ourselves for a long time. And since we started this journey in the CGIAR FOCUS Climate Security, we really wanted to understand what is the role of our science in the land, water, and food systems in explaining the climate security nexus. Throughout the 2020 and 2021, we've been having many stakeholders consultation with about 100 experts of the climate sector and the security sector to really unveil and to understand what would be the role of our climate science, land, water, food system science in this security in the security arena. And the messages are clear. Well, there has been pretty much a wide consensus among our stakeholders and the experts that, of course, climate is a threat multiplier, and we need policies and programs that are really tackling these nexus. Currently, interventions and operations and finance are failing to tackle the underlying drivers of security, and it's important for our climate science to be integrated in conflict prevention and peace building. What we need is accurate and timely data on the ground, which are fundamental to bridge the humanitarian development and peace nexus. And most and foremost, what we need is also to build bridges between these communities, the community of those who are working on climate, those who are working on land, water, and food systems, and those who are working on peace and security, which is fantastic that we're doing this also during this conference. And we need to build partnerships across sectors and to galvanize the expertise and harness innovation between these two different worlds. But of course, we cannot do anything if we don't have finance. We need to leverage finance towards more integrated programs. And this will be the key to actually address and break the cycle between climate and conflict. The NCGR FOCUS Climate Security, we have embraced this concept, and then our focus is really to make climate action peace and security sensitive across via 4 main research areas. The first is the evidence for peace, whereby we are trying to understand the complexity of climate insecurity for informed decision making, so trying to qualify and quantify the climate security nexus. The policy for peace aims to articulate the role of food systems in the climate crisis for policies and frameworks, and essentially it aims to support policy decisions to make them more climate security sensitive. Similarly, the Programming for Peace research area aims to develop peace-sensitive operations for millions of beneficiaries of the work that CGIAR and partners do. And finally, the Finance for Peace aims to leverage finance by aligning objective and incentives along the humanitarian development and peace nexus. And we do this through via research flagship initiatives. As you see here, we mentioned 9 with 9. We work on gender, we work on inequality, migration, mitigation, but we also have some specific contextual analysis that we do for the African continent, Latin America, also the MENA region. We don't have it here, but we're working on it. And we also launched most recently a program, PhD program with Wageningen University in Cyprus, working in the Sahel, in the Mekong Delta, and also in the Bangladeshi Delta. Specifically addressing the issue of climate security. We have many research questions, but here I'm listing some of the most important ones. So we want to understand. Yes?
Sorry, you have one or 2 minutes.
Okay, fantastic. So essentially our work, it really aims to answer the 4 main questions: the how, the where, and the what. We want to understand how is climate exacerbating the root causes of conflict? Where are the hotspots of climate insecurity? What should we do to break the cycle between climate and conflict? And who are the most vulnerable groups? So we have other questions, of course, looking at policy and the awareness, etc. But we're trying to really address several challenges that are related to evidence, to the lack of programmatic agenda. This is climate security sensitive, lack of investments. And we use an approach, multidisciplinary approach that really looks at integrating data-driven approaches, econometric analysis, social media analysis, spatial analysis, network analysis, and other types of statistical analysis, and integrating them with more qualitative approaches, including stakeholders engagement and community-based approach. Just to give an example of what this look like, I would like to show you this. So this is, for instance, one of the approaches that we use to quantify the climate security nexus. And we use econometric analysis really to unveil the impact of climate on the socioeconomic systems and how this impact actually translates in the increase of likelihood and intensity of conflict. And what we find, this is an example of a project that we've carried out in Ethiopia. We find that an increase in high temperature of more than 37 degrees in Ethiopia actually leads to an increase.
I'm really
just concluding. Yeah, but we find essentially that an increase of 1 day of 10 days, of temperature in Ethiopia actually leads to an increase of 3% of food security, and this exacerbation of food security actually leads to a 3% increase of conflict. Okay, I will just close here. We have many different approaches, but essentially what's to come. So we know that it's important to produce evidence, data, and hard evidence on how this climate security nexus unravels. And one of the most important innovations that will come up in 2022 will be this decision support tool, a climate security observatory that aims to qualify and quantify this nexus and answering essentially these questions. So I will close here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Grazia, for your presentation and for your perspective on CGIAR climate security nexus. So now we will go to more empirical case with Tom Deligiannis. I'm sorry if
That's fine.
If I pronounce it not correctly, from the Department of Global Studies, Wilfrid Laurier University, Canada, who is going to present us fascinating long-term research on conflict in Peru and perspectives for change conflict research. So the floor is yours. You have 12 minutes.
Thank you. I hope you give me a couple more minutes there. Thanks, everybody. Thank you to Bruno and to the entire team for organizing this wonderful meeting. I'm very conscious of the time, and so I'm going to skip some of the background and try to move to more of a discussion of my findings and spend most of my time on that. So I did a long-term study of one district in the highlands of southern Peru to try to understand how long-term patterns of human impacts on the natural environment and the resources that people use in this rural agricultural area, if that played a role in the unrest and violence that occurred in Peru with the Shining Path Rebellion and insurgency between 1980 and 1992. And I think that I'm going to be diving deep into the weeds of environment conflict research and the debates about environment conflict research and climate change research and links to violent conflict in my comments. And so I'm going to try to, I'll skip over some of the background for how I came to be in Peru and the questions and literature that drove that investigation, and try to focus a little bit for a few minutes talking about the case, what I found, and then some of the implications of that for research on climate change and conflict. And I think going off the very interesting and very complex research that CGIAR seems to be doing on these issues, I want to make a case, I think, for actually having us step back when we talk about trying to understand climate change security links. We should be, I think, also thinking more encompassingly on understanding the range of ways in which human pressures in the natural environment can help cause violent conflict, with climate change being only one dimension of this story. Now, to my case, I studied one district, the district of Chuschi, in the department of Ayacucho in south central Peru. And this is a very interesting district because the Sendero Luminoso, or Shining Path's first armed actions occurred in this particular district, and it suffered greatly over the course of the insurgency over the next decade almost. It's as you can see from my diagram on the left that shows the district in more detail, it's a very high altitude mountainous district with altitude ranges from about 2,300 meters to well over 4,500 meters. The center part of the district is a high altitude mountain range. The north and south are lower elevation areas where cultivated agriculture is concentrated. And in the center high altitude areas, we have highland grazing taking place. And that's most of the land area is used for highland grazing in this community. There are two communities in this district that are the center of my story, the community of Chuschi, which is the district headquarters, and the neighboring community of Quispellacta. And both of them lie in the community centers lie in the south of the district, across a small creek from each other. The story that I examined tells about land competition and the way in which human pressure in the environment played into competition between communities in the district and even neighboring districts in order to try to control grazing land and cultivated land that didn't have clear title or clear ownership. It turns out that one of the communities, Quispellacta, was largely the victor of these land conflicts. And if you look at the diagram on my screen, the center of that district outlined in black are the current boundary locations of the community of Quispellacta. And much of that land in the center of Quispellacta is land that they acquired over the last 50 to 70 years in conflict with their neighboring communities like Chuschi. Now, when I went to Peru and I wanted to understand if all of these pressures in the natural environment played a role in causing the Shining Path Rebellion, what I discovered actually was something quite different. I discovered that the community that won many of the land conflicts actually turned out to be the community that suffered the most in the government counterinsurgency operations in the area in the early 1980s. The community of Quispellacta suffered 7 to 10 times more deaths at the hands of government counterinsurgency factors because it was believed that they were a center of Shining Path support. And that was a bit of a puzzle to me because why would the community that actually won most of the land conflicts then throw their support behind the Shining Path Rebellion and seemingly put all of those hard-won gains that they've been fighting for centuries at risk? And so I dug deeper into what was going on there, and I discovered a story, I think, that shows that, that the community of Quispe did win the conflicts over land, but that they actually paid for those victories during the counterinsurgency because people who lost out in the land conflict from neighboring communities like Chuschi and nearby communities said that they were supporters of the Shining Path, and then essentially used that as a tool for revenge in the context of the government's counterinsurgency campaign to get back at them for their land victories. So it was essentially revenge by counterinsurgency. Now, I just want to very briefly sketch out, what I was seeing in this. Oh, sorry, I seem to be going back. Let me just push this forward here. I want to just very briefly sketch out what I saw in the community. I did a number of research methodologies, ethnographic interviews with over 60 members of the oldest members of the community, some of them almost 100 years old, many of them over 70, to try to understand long-term patterns of change in terms of agricultural relationships, livelihoods, going back decades. I did archival research. I did field measurements of land degradation in the communities to try to understand how pressure on the natural environment played into this. And I developed a livelihood framework for trying to make sense of all of this in the context of human-environment conflict outcomes that puts the household at the center of the discussion, tries to understand how people adapt and cope to various pressures on their livelihoods, both from natural variation, but also from political economic factors, from climate change, weather events, et cetera, and to understand how adaptation and coping plays out, and use that as a way of trying to make sense of what I was seeing in the community. Very briefly, in the district of Chuschi, when it was colonized by the Spanish colonial policy concentrated all of the residents, people who lived in that area, into two major central urban areas in the south of the district, Chuschi and Quispe. And they depopulated much of the north of the district and gave that land to various Spanish elites who set up a series of small estates, haciendas, in the northern regions to control those areas of green that you see in the top of that map, which are essentially cultivated areas in that region. Over time, the hacienda economy began to decline, and community members in Quispe found an opportunity to buy back some of that land that had been taken from them. And that hatched area on the map shows what was bought back in the mid to late 1800s, much to the displeasure of neighboring communities who also claimed that land. Over the next 100 years, as a result of a variety of factors, including the increasing lack of land for people who were concentrated in those southern agricultural zones, people began to migrate and settle into the center part of the district, both from Quispe and other neighboring communities. And they were migrating into areas that were essentially contested and didn't have clear land rights that were recognized by all of the neighboring communities and by the Peruvian state. And that led, oh boy, 2 minutes. That led to a series of violent conflicts in the 60s and 70s. And eventually, those conflicts spilled out into open warfare and violence between the different communities at various times. But it was relatively small-scale violence because they didn't have access to automatic weapons like you see in many parts of rural Africa or other parts of Latin America as a result of the drug conflicts. So the victory of Quispe in grabbing and controlling much of that central part of the district was consolidated in a peace agreement in early 1982 between community leaders in Quispe and Chuschi, who said, you know what, we need to settle this once and for all. They got together, they settled the land conflict that had gone back to pre-colonial times. I can't get into why it goes back to pre-colonial times. And Quispe emerged as the major victor, and they were doing this right at the time when the Shining Path was establishing control over the district. So there were a variety of pressures that were telling community members it was a good time in order to settle this dispute. But it led, as I said, to a terrible counterinsurgency campaign by the Peruvian military, one that actually didn't discriminate very well between combatants and non-combatants, supporters, non-supporters, members of rival communities or not. In the eyes of the military, anybody who was in the highlands was a potential insurgent, and they acted on information about who potentially was an insurgent and repressed and killed and disappeared more people accordingly based on the information they received, much to the disadvantage of the community of Chuschi. And of course, those figures, as I showed, prove in some ways how one community suffered much more than the other. Now, what are the lessons of this for climate conflict research? Well, there are a number of different lessons. I won't be able to talk about them all. One, though, however, is that I think we need to get back into the field and do very detailed local case studies with a very long timeline, and then try to combine that with some of the more sophisticated econometric statistical approaches that our friend from CGIAR was also discussing, that you can have a very interesting and useful ground truthing by doing case studies and bringing those long temporal perspectives together with a rich understanding of local conditions. As well, my second theoretical finding discusses the fact that this case demonstrates that household adaptation to environmental change, including responses to emerging slow onset climate change impacts, had social conflict implications. Human pressures on the environment and on livelihood resources combined with a variety of political, economic, and social factors to aggravate group conflict between these two communities in the district and up in the decades leading up to the Shining Path insurgency. And this finding, speaks to two important issues on climate conflict research. First, I think we have to recognize that we have to take into consideration how supply and demand changes to people's availability of resources, how that can play a role in helping to cause violent conflict. Climate change often operates as a supply factor. It influences the supply of available livelihood resources for small-scale agriculturalists. But there are also other demand impacts that were also evident in this area. Population growth as a result of the demographic transition that the country was going through, a tremendous explosion in the early part of the 20th century was reducing land availability. Other kinds of silviculture and green revolution technologies were introducing species and plants that were having destructive impacts on livelihoods for people in the district, as you can see from the diseased potatoes, a result of using too much pesticides year after year. And climate change was also having a role there, allowing agriculture to expand to high altitude areas where it had never been conducted before, but also having a converse impact of making lower altitude areas much more difficult and sustainable to farm, especially in the context of reduced rainfall, increased heat, and the reliance on irrigated agriculture being much more important. So I think there's been a lot of discussion recently in some quarters about how climate change induced violent conflict is really a function of political, social, and economic factors. And I think that perhaps misses a very important dimension of the story that you can't explain. Thank you, I hear. You can't explain everything that was going on in that community if you also don't pay attention to other supply and demand factors that were stressing livelihoods of community members in the district. I would also just like to quickly just advance and say my main findings in the other areas. And one is that I think we need to see climate change in the context of other environmental changes as a slow onset environmental change that really helps shape structural and process factors in a lot of situations and condition the kinds of livelihood decisions that people are going to make. In the same way that we might think of economic changes as a long-term structural impact. Also, we need to think about how human-induced environmental pressure isn't just important for conflict onset, for starting civil wars, but that it actually can also play a very important role in helping to determine the nature of violence in violent conflict. So in my case, human pressure on the natural environment worsened group conflict, which was later expressed in the context of the counterinsurgency and helps explain why violence took the particular dynamic that it did in that counterinsurgency event. That certain groups and people suffered more than others. We can't understand that if we don't pay attention to the human pressure on the natural environment and the resource impacts that had on people's livelihoods. And finally, we, I think, need to put human livelihoods, household livelihoods, back at the center of our analysis. A great deal of climate change conflict research is done with using very large statistical models that have a very difficult time in actually modeling household livelihood change. And in fact, I think they're missing a very big part of the story by not doing a good job at modeling how cultivator and pastoralist livelihoods operate and the kinds of choices and decisions they make, and the way in which those choices and decisions can then have social conflict implications. And that's all I want to say. I can answer more questions in the discussion, but thank you, and I apologize for going a bit over.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tom, for your passionate presentation of your research. So now we will move to the next presentation. Sarah Makun, who is from University of Florida, Center for African Studies and College of Public Health and Health Professions. She will present on research for development in a context of climate change and political instability. So with her presentation, we will move from Peru to Sahel. Sarah, are you online? The floor is yours.
Oui, et merci beaucoup. Je vous remercie pour l'invitation d'aujourd'hui et pour m'accueillir. J'ai vraiment apprécié la conférence jusqu'au présent et j'aimerais remercier ceux qui ont organisé l'événement. Je m'appelle Sarah Makun, comme on a dit, et je suis sociologue. Je travaille dans le domaine de santé publique en étudiant les rapports entre les systèmes sociaux et les systèmes naturels. Et surtout, je m'intéresse aux théories de systèmes et j'étudie comment ces systèmes humains naturels couplés affectent les résultats en matière de santé. Et la plupart de la présentation, je vais parler en anglais, mais je voulais seulement me présenter en français. So I put on the introduction a bit about where I am. Please check out the Sahel Research Group at the University of Florida. We would love to foster ongoing collaboration with those of you here today through that effort. Today I'm talking, I really appreciated Tom's presentation just before now. I am a field worker. I come out of humanitarian aid and development work, spent a decade doing that before embarking on an academic space. And I think that we can't lose sight of the local. I'm talking today at a much more sort of 30,000 foot level, but I just want to reinforce that, that empirical local context is critical to all that we're talking about today. So today I'm thinking about research for development, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm using the platform today to sort of play out a hypothesis that's manifesting in my head these days. But as introduction for those of you who are maybe more solidly in a traditional research space, I work as an applied research scientist, and most of my research these days is in the domain or field that we would recognize as research for development. So what do we mean by that? When we think about research, we're very much thinking about classically theoretical, linear, sequential scientific work that aims to publish new knowledge, scientific knowledge, testing a hypothesis or not, exploratory, where development is sort of at the other end of that. And classically, traditionally, development is pragmatic. It's very focused on outcomes, results. We think about log frames, monitoring and evaluation, the work that we're doing. And candidly, it's often very chaotic. It's highly adaptive, and it has to be an iterative process. So this was one of the real shocks that I had coming from development into academia, was the transition of two somewhat juxtaposed spaces. But the space of research for development really aims to combine the two. And where I have found my own sort of niche in that is that, or let me say, what I enjoy about it is that it really focuses on the health and well-being of vulnerable populations. So really honing in on the most vulnerable, and how do we leverage and develop the right science to service those individuals. So there's a real social justice element to research for development. So the dynamics of the Sahel present really great opportunities for work like research for development. So I won't run through all of these. I think I'm somewhat preaching to the choir with those of you in the room and online, but climate change, population growth of the Sahel, weak governance structures, poor agricultural outputs and productivity, environmental degradation over the past at least 5 to 6 decades, high inequality, which is largely gendered, but also intersectional, and systemic poverty are some of the dynamics of the Sahel that render it a highly vulnerable geographic space, of course, with a range of experiences within that. But it makes it ripe for research for development. Some of these statistics, but I'll share with you particularly the latest IPCC report. The projections of climate change are not just those things we know about heat and severe weather events, dust storms, flooding, but specifically, and I think Tor Benjaminson referenced this before, changes to the rainy season are called into question. The massive uncertainty around the timing and quantity of rains that will come in an area that is so reliant on rain-fed agriculture, be it livestock or crop production, is really a key to climate change impact in the region. And then demographic growth, understanding that at least if you look at Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, so leaving out what we often count Senegal as the 6th in this belt of the Sahel, the population could double between now and 2040. So from 80 to 160 million inhabitants. So this confluence of climate change and rapid population growth are two of the most important dynamics of the region. So when we think about, when we think about that, suddenly these areas for research for development emerge. And it's quite easy to see, if you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, how the Sahel pops up as an area of great need for research for development. So in great need for agricultural transformation, improved health outcomes, quality education, hygiene and sanitation, and importantly, human and institutional capacity development. So these are domains that I've generated specific to the Sahel based on my knowledge and research there, with the sort of specific problems that really rise to the top among many others in the Sahel. So you can see those. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the dynamics that play in the Sahel make it a fairly good match for the interventions of research for development. Now, my area of expertise is in health specifically, and I have increasingly over time as a scholar of systems theory, as I said before, really looking at coupled human natural systems, nutrition and food security emerge as the space in the Sahel as the outcome of interest that I am continually coming back to. So I give you some statistics here on the nutritional insecurity of the Sahel. Many of you know as well as I do. And on the right of this graph, you can see importantly from 2000 to 2018, there was progress. So while the rates are still very high globally, if you put any other sort of high income country on there, it just looks like a flat line at the bottom of that graph. Rates are falling. And you see this is stunting, which is chronic malnutrition in kids, but it's dropped. Niger's is still very high, over 46%, but it's falling over time. So the rates, we're getting better, but the rates are still horrible. So these are all those outcomes that we're interested in as development practitioners. So if you look at this conceptual framework of what is determining and what's driving health, and I'm using health because it's the area I know best, but you could have chosen another set of variables in there. My argument here is that the impact, so impacts are the outcomes. The health is the outcome that we're looking at, but there's this machine of determinants of health or determinants of vulnerability. And importantly, there are really significant structural and social determinants of health inequities. And those include public policies, social policies, and they include all of those intersectional factors that create the social landscape of a society. So that includes education, livelihood, social class, gender, caste, ethnicity, all of those things that we then look at as through an intersectional lens to understand how they manifest in ultimately these intermediary determinants of health. So I, as a guiding framework, I'm then thinking, okay, so then climate change and political insecurity are two of the really important structural and social determinants that exacerbate or undermine, depending upon the directionality you want to take there, the already complex social and structural determinants of health. So the Sahel is already, it is notoriously well documented in the literature for its complexity, social complexity, societal complexity, environmental and ecologic complexity. So I give examples here of how climate change and structural determinants are interacting, political instability with those structural determinants. Then on the right, climate change with social determinants and political instability with social determinants. And I won't read through the examples I thought through this week in putting this together, but I'll give you in depth. And this is from another paper I did a few years back, looking really at how, when you think about who's affected, how does it change the way we think about vulnerability? So in this example, we were looking at livestock holders. A lot of my work is with pastoralists and livestock holders of different varying degrees of pastorality. But looking at how gender changes the way we understand climate impact. And here in this model, we took a model of vulnerability and adaptive capacity and threw on a gendered lens. And in this paper really mapped out, it looks completely different. We understand vulnerability differently when we look at how these drivers of vulnerability affect women differently, whether that's in collection of wood, hauling of water, exposure to violence. It's a different reality. So if we think about climate change impact, and again, I'll hone in on Niger, a space I know best among the Sahelian countries, we see changes in rainfall patterns. And we see loss of indigenous species availability during food crisis for use as what we call famine foods. Household composition is changing. So climate change impacting the traditional livelihoods of people sends men on exode more often. So men are migrating to cities more often. Household composition is then changing. Gender dynamics are changing. Women are now making decisions in the household. Divorce rates are up. In-depth focus groups I've done north of Tanut with pastoral groups say divorce didn't happen before, but now men are gone, women are making decisions, and they're feeling empowered to say, no, I want a different life for myself. So you're seeing all sorts of differences that are ultimately, can we not link these back to climate change? We can have that discussion later, but it's part of the landscape. The landscape is shifting. And to jump ahead, all of these things are affecting the erosion of traditional safety networks, the effectiveness of traditional coping mechanisms, and thresholds of resilience in a highly resilient ecological social system are changing. And this is the culmination, I would argue, of the interaction between globalization and climate change, two global drivers of change in this landscape. I'm going to zip through this piece on globalization, but I will just put a touch point in here to the Lysenko and O'Brien research that really says we have to think about interactions and feedback, which is, again, one of the pieces that Tom referenced that resonated with me, is that we get feedback loops. So it's not just linear, it's this complexity that we have to understand if we really want to understand vulnerability. And this came through in an analysis I did during my dissertation research among the Tuareg in northern Niger. But the link back to research for development is this. Research for development is needed in the Sahel. I believe that, but it's complex. It's really hard to do. And some of the complexities are listed here. We're navigating conflict. I have 3 ongoing projects right now, all of them in spaces that are highly conflict ridden. And I shared with Bruno, I was evacuated out of Ethiopia 3 weeks ago because of the conflict that's arising there. It's really hard to do the work in the places that need it. But this hypothesis that I'm sort of working on in my head is it's the very drivers of vulnerability that make research for development necessary that undermine our ability to do it well. And so it has to be, if it's going to be research, it's going to have to be R4D, because that's where the iteration and adaptiveness comes in. Traditional research doesn't allow for that. So we have to have an iterative approach, whether it's adaptive management or whatnot. But I won't read through this. Weak institutions, infrastructure, shifting livelihoods, all of these make the research that we do harder to do, but also more necessary. So this idea, climate change and political insecurity are affecting all of the things that both require and create a landscape that needs research for development, but also undermines and creates an impediment to doing it. So this slide, I've attempted to summarize that. We leverage science with R4D in order to address complex problems for the most vulnerable. The Sahel is a great space for that in terms of the need, and R4D holding great promise. But there are myriad interconnected structural and social determinants that map out the complexity of the Sahel. Climate change and political instability are exacerbating those. And climate change and instability are making the research for development that we're trying to do to address those problems more difficult. And I'll leave it at that. I really think the next questions, and I hope we can have a discussion about what is the role of, whether it's the CG centers, whether it's academics, whether it's NGOs, this research for development space, how do we do it better and more innovatively to be adaptive and reach the needs of those vulnerable populations in the Sahel?
Thank you, Sarah, so much for this great presentation that put us to think better about methodological issues as well. And of importance of doing research in the Sahel. So further, I don't know if we have Philippe online. Okay. So now we will move to our final panelist, Professor Philippe Laurier from the Department of Geography and School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia, whose presentation is entitled Postcarbon Wars, Climate Crisis and Energy Transition Conflicts. So we will go to, once again, to a little bit another perspective, but I think that after Philippe's presentation, you will see how all panelists will be interconnected and will be interrelated. So, Philippe, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup.
Yes, Philippe Billon. I'm the Public School and Global Affairs Institute. I've been working on everything which is conflict around natural resource. I worked on armed conflict in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and for the last 5 years I've been working on everything which is conflict in the project of mining, essentially, everything which is conflict around that, and also the mitigation of climate change and for and their impact on social movement. I'll start my presentation about something you have seen recently. November 20th, 2021, there was actually a puff in the media about David Suzuki declaration, which is one of the Canada's most meditated intellectual, which about an extinction rebellion campaign. Actually said, well, that if our leaders do not take care of what's happening, the pipeline would explode. This created reaction, essentially, from the part of the Alberta government. Suzuki made some excuse. He said every assertion that violence is unavoidable is false and will not actually help us to solve the climate crisis. But he said that violence comes from the authority, government, RCMP, and in fact, because they are declaring war to those who are protesting. So to add to Dave Suzuki statement, and it is in line here, the coordinator of national action in Canada, ZADAC, for Extinction Rebellion, had not only the pipeline will blow up, but we can be sure that world leader will be put on trial for treason or wars, be killed. Otherwise said they will be assassinate. Although Extinction Rebellion activists are non-violent, we cannot control the action of those outside this movement who may commit acts of violence. So, effectively, when we do talk about climate wars, especially in the Ottawa Confederacy, we're talking about actions, movement, and reaction to the part of the government of different authorities, which have a very violent aspects. It's not necessarily on the physical side. There's a restraint on both sides, at least in this country, but we have seen a dialectic which is quite warlike. Alberta had what they call the war room to try to counter the opposition to tar sands, and the climate studies, in fact, will essentially focus on climate war and climate immigration. We've seen that this morning. I would like to draw your attention on when we are seeing people with rifles in Canada. Essentially, it's for everything that which is blockades, things like that. Naturally, these in fact, these are the barricades raised by Westwatton for the pipeline, natural gas pipelines there. So there is actually impacts which are not very good for the image of the federal government. I'm sure that it's not very good also for kind of people you would like to have in the RCMP. And at the same time, you can see the military is being deployed only a few kilometers from my place to actually put sandbag to protect gardens along small rivers. So there's kind of a malaise around these climate war, and in Canada we are asking ourselves if we are not in fact waging the wrong war. We're protecting infrastructural projects which will accentuate the climate damages, even if indeed if natural gas could be considered as being a better alternative than coal, but still the image is quite troubling for the public. So why are we in that situation? Everybody is aware. Please read the projection gap report if you have not do it, but essentially we should be 50% lower than the production of fossil energies from here to 2030. We're not going there. Why? Because even if we are seeing an effort on this side of coal production, the exception made of India and Russia for oil, and it's quite the contrary, especially for Canada in terms of exojoule. We still are 1.7 over and above, so 1.2 net above is quite considerable. Indeed, all of that happened in a system where not only the acceleration of decarbonization happened, but it's also there is an affirmative action for the defense community, right territories and environment. So right before the pandemic, news were dominated in this country by the alliance between some Wet'suwet'en leader and some Mohawk activists with a blocus essentially of the railroads lines that had an important consequence on the economy. The environment, climate, water treaties are all involved, and it's not only happening in Canada, it's happening elsewhere, not only with the infrastructures and the fossil energy coal, but also for green energy, or so-called green energy. This is anti-windmill protest that you have here, and I have one of them in Brittany here, and they in fact, there's serious protests taking place. So we made a study in 2020. It's more or less the summary that has been presented to you that can allow you to have a global image of what happened since 1997, since the Kyoto Protocols. We have, by and large, 650 conflicts happened across the world. The first thing that we found is that there is certainly a majority of protest and with the fossil energy, but also there is an enormous proportions against the so-called green energy. What does that mean? It means that you have two fronts. In one sense, these social environmental movement will help us to accelerate some energy transition, but at the same time they will break it down from a technological standpoint. Techno-captain will not be able to deploy like a lot of government will wish for.
Please, Julian.
Conflicts, when we look at that a little bit more closely, there's also another study. There's localization factors and mobilization factors. And they think we can start from your home, you can start with the work of where you're local. There's also there's the racial discrimination. There's a lot of people who are indifferent to the problem of governance, access to climatic justice, which are far from the Aboriginal leadership as well, or Indigenous leadership as well. Who takes part in these groups? There are a lot of people are in these groups. They've been the 85-year-old granny. There can be blockades where blockades as they get the families. We have political parties, international organizations. What happens basically? We can see that about 10% of these 650 conflicts are mortal, cause a great deal of mortality. 2/3 are high intensity conflicts. They're not all equal, and all the conflicts are equal. There's in terms of intensity. The pipelines, of course, there's a lot of mobilization against pipelines and repressive outcomes of those who and particularly there's more deaths when we're dealing with gas and oil. When we're dealing with oil. Other project-level conflict outcomes. We're talking about high-level investment. About half of them, the investments are not affected. The development projects continue, but about half of them don't progress. About 28% are they suspended or they're cancelled. So some of them progress, maybe half progress. As I mentioned, we either see acceleration or a slowdown. And a great of these projects, we see a transformation of the energy context or the energy transition. What we're trying to we take an energy addition as we slow down the fossil fuel project. If we for 10 units renewable energy compared to 1 unit of fossil fuel. So this transition from fossil fuels. So there's got to be kind of a subscription. We're talking about transforming the society, and there's a slowdown in growth. Slowdown growth. Where the political and economic consequence, the major, is political and economics. A slowdown. We talk about the different. There's a transformation of the for a sure climatic future to make sure we have good climatic. We have to improve energy infrastructures, and we want cleaner fossil fuels. We've got to increase the renewable energy sources. We've got to go towards we go to be the techno-capitalism to low technology, and low tech to simple living practices, or and of course a lot of the Chinese, they talk about it's high tech capitalism. They think they're working in crucial sectors. What's the roadmap? I've only got maybe about 30 more seconds. First one, decriminalization of environmental defenders. So we must decriminalize them. We can talk about climate reformers. There's abuse of the use of recourse to injunctions. It's a criminal offense. This should be private law. It should be private law or civil law. There should be criminalization, decriminalization. The second, concrete energy transition and energy consumption reduction. The third is greater consultation impact of the mitigation for clean energy projects. The fourth is a global coordination towards a managed decline in fossil fuel production. As you know, the Quebec government joined the Oil and Gas Alliance. These are marginal producers of who produce clean fossil fuels. This is the end of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to all the questions that you may have. Thank you very much, Philippe, for your presentation. It was a wonderful presentation. You bring us into the question, the dimension of security, the post-carbon wars, and we can look at the overview. We see. We're talking about a very good perspective of the impact on security. I think we have enough time at the present time to engage in question period with the attendants, discussions in the room from the participants. I know we already questions in the chat, have already beginning to appear in the chat, which have been sent to us online, or from the room. Is anybody like to stand up in the room, go to the microphone?
Oui. Thank you to everybody for the presentations, all very interesting. I have a question for Tom. You had such rich detail of your case that we didn't have time to hear about, and so I was wondering if I could prompt you about one aspect of Peru, which may be outside of the time frame that you were primarily focused on, but I was just curious about the context around governance and kind of the ideological frameworks within which policy is determined, and if you could say anything about the kind of well-documented neoliberal turn in Peruvian governance under the Garcia regime, if that kind of framework within which the land that you were referring to was being allocated or reallocated might have contributed to the sources of the conflict, or if that's just falling outside of the scope that you were primarily focusing on. Thank you.
No, thanks for your question. So Garcia came to power actually several years after the Shining Path insurgency already began. Land reform was instigated by the Peruvian military in 1968. But the problem with land reform in Peru was that there was simply just not enough land to give it to everybody who wanted land. And the neoliberal turn to governance in Peru and other parts of Latin America came much later, into the late 1980s, in the Peruvian context. So the context of land as an issue that people were fighting over before and at the start of the Shining Path Rebellion, it was really a context where land had been, people had been dispossessed historically from much of their land by elites in the country, and the country was going through a process of of people wanting to get that land back. But in many cases, titles were unclear, borders, boundaries were unclear, ownership was contested, and this is by no means something only common to Peru. It's quite common in many developing countries, even today. And so that added a whole nother layer of complexity to the fights over ownership, and the turn towards export agriculture and mining, export mining, and large agricultural estates in the context of how much of Latin America and even Peru sees itself today was another layer of socio-political change that took place later in the late 1980s.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. I actually had a question for Philippe Le Billon, if I can ask it in French, if it's possible.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for your presentation on the Postcarbon Wars. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have one question, maybe two questions. The first question being, when we're talking about climate security, we talk about energy transition, and what you talk about what you show is that this energy transition, there's a lot of tension. There's in the models, the energy models that we're going to have to adopt. There'll be a lot of conflict or tension provoking, and this will particularly affect the vulnerable populations. Do you have any other examples? Other contexts when you talk about this energy transition, which is a source of conflict, and they certainly become a source of. That's my first question. Second question that I would like to ask you: with the choices in Europe that are going on in Europe, particularly in France, very very technological choices, and particularly nuclear energy, what's the source of conflict with those choices? And we even have similar episodes of resistance to them. Are we headed towards these very highly technological solutions? Those are my two questions. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you. The first question about the energy transition. I've got my colleague Alex Dunmat, D-U-L-L-A-T. I think it was Dulat. I think he works in Mexico. The ODF is involved in that, which is there are major problems in terms of execution and the dispossession of land, etc. everybody, all communities, they're all talking about compensation, consultation. There'll be will people really truly benefit from the greater energy security after the projects? There's a lot of experience acquired in the hydroelectric projects, in many commissions, International Commission, on dams, on hydroelectric dams. And unfortunately, practically speaking, there's been a major study in Latin America, and according to, there was a bit of expect from the consultation process are generally biased. Quite plainly speaking, even the agreement that these projects are being imposed. They're really being imposed, and with not really a lot of consultation, because the government wants to progress. They want development. The investors are there. I say, why do a few dozen people block the project? Generally speaking, maybe that didn't appear clearly in my presentation. These conflicts crystallize a lot of tensions already existing in society. It becomes a struggle, zone for struggle, a symbol of struggle, of the tension which is inherent in society. These vast, huge projects, these mega projects, often call for national cohesion, but whether or not that can be achieved. So it goes much further beyond than just a question of energy security. It goes much further. For the technological choices made in different countries, high technology choices in France, we might expect that it will become more and more complicated. You mentioned in France, there's also the model alternative communities which are occupying these localizations. The West Wheaton peoples in British Columbia. There's not just the West Wheaton, but there's the Zalist Zal, and the Aboriginal Alliance, are blocking. A lot of blockades are set up on some of these projects. Some of these at the West Wheaton. There's no miracle solution. I gave you kind of a roadmap. There are some solutions. Nuclear solution has maybe greater chances for success in a certain way, in a certain respect, though. But it's changed. These things have changed. Can change the depends on whether it's reported in media, by the media, and how the media reports nuclear. But these are choices that might lead to dramatic consequences as well. How do we go forward? Not need a solution. I will say no more. And there's we need national coherence, of course. And so right now the companies have been they have to be honest. They have to be transparency. They have to really engage in discussions and negotiations with the communities affected by the projects. So
we have a question from John Sears, and I think it's an interesting question to Sarah. On the research for development, actually, John Sears, he is asking actually a provocative question, saying that many development actors, institutions, researchers are not actually yet well placed or willing to lead an adaptive and iterative research for development that is really needed. And I would like to go further with this question, and I would like to comment Sarah on how is she, what is her perspective on relations of power between funding agencies and research agenda, and how she positions herself regarding research for development that she is talking about. So, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana, for that question and the clarification. So I think you went directly to the direction that I would take it, which is that, yes, I agree that many development actors, that is inclusive of what we might call implementing partners in the field, NGOs, but also research institutions and absolutely academic research institutions, perhaps none more guilty than the US of being sort of the antithesis of nimble, right? They're not adaptive. They're these massive bureaucratic structures, but they also are responsive to donor demands. So I recognize my audience here has a different, perhaps, set of donors, but when I look at classic funding agencies through the US national government, so that might be National Institute for Health or National Science Foundation, but even in geo partners, we have Gates funding money or USAID, bilateral aid, DFID. We have a funded project through the Canadian government, IDRC. Interestingly, IDRC is probably among the most flexible of donors that I've worked with, Gates Foundation being sort of the most. But donors, it's very hard to have funded research without having deliverables. Yes, yay, IDRC. It's a dream to work with IDRC. I'd echo that. John just dropped that in the chat. But I really, I think you're spot on that it isn't, that the structural system is reifying the problem, right? So we have to think about what are the changes that we need. And I'll drop into my more local level research. And I've done a lot of research of late on food security, nutritional security of children under 2, and specifically in Burkina Faso. And from that, culminating from that work, as well as others of the USAID funded Livestock System Innovation Lab, we wrote a paper calling for, after key informant interviews of experts around the world, one of the major limitations to doing research for development well to improve child health outcomes, and I'll put the Sahel in this pot, though it's a global statement, is the timing. 3 to 5 year funding cycles are not, that doesn't allow itself the flexibility and adaptation that's needed to answer the scientific research questions that require an iterative approach. So that's one example of where we've got to go back to donors and push hard and say, 3 years is a joke. 5 years is getting there, as long as there's another 5 years afterwards to do something with the information that you get. So I'm not saying that the temporal nature of funding is the only problem, but it's indicative of the fact that what donors ask for doesn't allow for iterative, adaptive management of projects. The other part that you alluded to is that we also aren't necessarily recruiting and training the right kind of people, right? So I think one of the things when I run a social science research lab, and I have students from all across the University of Florida campus, as well as globally, who chime in via Zoom these days. But one of the things we really try and do is work on translational science and working across teams and across disciplines, because we have traditionally in the academic traditions in the US trained deeply in a specific discipline and have valued less the translational, what we call T training. So we have that deep STEM, but we don't have the training that allows us to make the connections across spaces. And if to do that, you have to cultivate a different kind of learner, a different kind of scholar. So I think you're right that it isn't simply the donors. We can't put it on them. We as academic institutions and as spaces of traineeship for future scholars have to value the characteristics of researchers that can handle and can adapt to what's required to do adaptive management, because it's certainly not for everyone. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. Okay, we have another question from the audience.
Hi, thank you. This one's directed to Sarah McCune as well. Sarah, I was struck when you mentioned that you'd been doing field research and then you had to be evacuated quite recently. And then when you said that many of the areas where the need for research is greatest is where it's hardest to do research because of conditions of insecurity. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about, what is the solution there? What's being looked at? Do you just have to put it down, pick it back up later when things are more secure? Do you have to shift your focus elsewhere? Or is anybody looking at kind of, more experimental or innovative solutions like, partnerships with maybe security actors, or, would that present its own set of problems? I'd be curious to hear you talk about that, and maybe that's something that Grazia also would have something to say on, so I'll leave it open there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you again for the question. I'll be brief. I think we could have a long 2-hour lunch and brainstorm this better, but 2 things come to mind. One is the only reason that the research persists and moves forward is local partnerships. So we have, I'll use the case of Ethiopia. We have extremely strong partners, and we're 4 years into two projects that are nested. They're looking at real sort of deep science, gut function, underlying causes of malnutrition. So we have a lab that's up and running, but we have a robust partnership with a team at Raoul-Dandurand University that has, they're the reason it's running. So if my presence were required in the field all of the time, it would have died a long time ago. Travel's been disrupted. The plan, we've flipped conferences. I mean, we haven't even talked about COVID, overlay COVID and everything that it's done to field research. We've had to be very adaptive. That's Gates funding, and they've been completely supportive of that adaptive management approach that we've had to take. A different donor I don't think would have been as flexible, but it's the partners that have allowed the research to persist. So this trip was the first time I've been back to this 4.5, almost 5-year partnership since March of 2020 when I was last there. And I needed to go. It was time. I mean, those partnerships don't survive without collaboration and sort of a presence in the field. And so, yeah, it only works because they're able to carry the torch and to keep it going. So that goes back to strong institutions, right? We have a very strong institutional partner, but if you don't have the capacity, we have to work on building local and institutional capacity, both in human capacity and in institutional capacity. Now, the caveat to that is there's been and this is the second point I would raise, is how do we do it? There has been a massive learning curve that's happened here at our university since we received this large USAID grant 7 years ago. So it's the largest grant University of Florida has ever had. It's $50 million for the first 5 years. And we have now 42 to 46 funded projects globally. And our, as you can imagine, legal counsel and import control, there's a rigidity of this bureaucracy that just isn't a good match for doing the kind of work that we do in the field. So as much as I say we have to build the institutional and human capacity on the other end, we also have to build it here because we're moving towards a more adaptive space. So expectation management, what's realistic to expect of a partner overseas? What happens when our IRB is in direct conflict with their IRB? Theirs wins, right? There has to be a process set up for overcoming those spaces. So those are the two quick things that I would respond in terms of how does it persist? How do you keep going? Is having good partners overseas and being ready to work on institutional learning at home in our own spaces.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So are we having other questions? Okay, Marc-André?
On question line, please. For everybody, for any of the panelists who would like to respond to this. The person has a question, how to ensure that research on climate conflicts don't become instrumentalized to penalize and criminalize, to create greater confusion for the exploitation of natural resources by the most vulnerable populations.
Could you repeat the question in English as well, please?
Sure, I will. So basically the person, like the person online is asking how to ensure that research on climate change and on climate conflicts mostly is not instrumentalized to penalize or to even criminalize the exploitation of natural resources by the most vulnerable people. Here we go. So the question is for everybody. Don't know if anybody wants to jump in first. Maybe Grazia wants to.
Perhaps break the ice on this one, and perhaps link in with the previous question. How do we do in situations where there's conflict? Perhaps I can start with that one. So CGIAR is very new to the security space. Let's put it that way. We are the new kids on the block. We've always stopped short at understanding the impact of what we do on climate, on peace and security. So we are very, very well suited to understand the impact of climate on land, water, systems, but we're not really working the areas of contest where there are conflicts or big, large-scale conflicts. Of course, what we come to realize in the past few years that we've been working on this topic is that actually the conflicts they don't have to be large and affecting a large population, even in the target beneficiaries that we work with. Then there are conflicts, specifically on natural resources, and this is linked to the second question. The access to water, pastoralists and farmers conflicts. We see that all the time in the work that we do. But in fact, I mean, what Sarah said is particularly important. Partnerships fundamental for that, but it's essential to be in the field. And then the strategy that we are adopting at the moment is that to actually delocalize, so decentralize our team in all of the regions and countries that we actually work in. So we're going to have a part of our team in Eastern Central Africa, Western Central Africa, part of our team in the Eastern Southern Africa, and in the MENA region, somebody else in the Central America Dry Corridor, somebody else also in Asia, because we are going to need people working in these countries, and we're going to have to be there. When it's of course not completely possible because of insurgencies of big conflicts, then of course we need to rely on other people, on other partners. But what's really important is the actual the awareness of the people that we are working with without our organization, without CGIAR, regardless of the importance of considering peace and security implication of the work that we do. Because one of the things that we really didn't really understand in the past was the actual implication of our climate adaptation strategy, climate mitigation strategy on the dynamics and the different balance in the systems that we are going to work with. So in giving the opportunity to certain people to access certain strategy to mitigate the impact of climate and then excluding others, or giving some resources to some and then excluding others, that of course can be cause of conflict. We're not the first to actually say that climate adaptation and mitigation have actually created conflict and tensions throughout the world, and the CGIAR is not immune to that. So we really need to these are the tools that essentially we are using to avoid creating further tensions and conflict in maybe some of the contexts that allegedly, I mean, they are the most peaceful, they're not really fragile, but really to reduce the risk of the escalation of the conflict. We need to first understand how we can avoid creating harm with the work that we are doing, and potentially understanding also the peace contribution, the peace potential of the climate adaptation strategy. For that, we are going to be working with our policy partners, but our program developers as well. So in the development of our projects, then we need to understand how to do our job definitely better. And to respond to the second second question, so how can we avoid to sort of how can climate research, climate conflict, climate security research can avoid sort of criminalizing in a way the use of natural resources by most vulnerable people? Well, in our research strategy starting in January 2022, what we are going to do, and this will be a critical part of our strategy, will be to design, to co-design and test some of those solutions, some of the climate action solutions together with the different communities and different groups. So we aim to be in the field and in those networks of stakeholders, including communities and different groups of farmers, pastoralists, so you name it, and trying to essentially adapt the solutions that CGIAR has been developing for the past 50 years in mitigating the impact of climate, adapting this to the local needs and generating with the group, with the people, directly with the people and the policymakers, decision makers, private sector, investors, etc., generating those solutions that are actually fitting and they are most suitable for the context. So using collective actions, participatory approach, and so on and so forth, like to really develop those solutions that are tailored to the needs. We think that in this way, the natural resource management, natural resource access, etc., can really become a piece of the puzzle that doesn't necessarily need to be exploited by a certain group, but rather than the others, but actually can become a peace building type of exercises to maintain security in different contexts. Thanks.
I just wanted to add too that in my particular case, the state and elites were often the source of a lot of the problems for settling conflicts. And the conflicts over land that had stretched back centuries were only really settled when the communities themselves were able to sit down and hash out a solution in the context of a lot of external pressure, I might add. So I think we should also recognize that if we're going to design climate change interventions that we think might help peace building, we should probably, in order to borrow on what Tor Benjamin said this morning, we should probably recognize going in who some of the actors have been who have been key in causing the problems in the first place. And often it's the state or very powerful elites that try to take advantage of the resource systems for their own benefit. In Peru, when there were disputes in communities over water, rather than finding a way to have local communities solve the water disputes, the state simply took control of all water rights and said that they were going to dictate what the solution was. So, we can talk about participatory action all we want, but we should probably also, if we're giving advice to external donors, those external donors should be putting pressure on governments to really empower local actors to find solutions and give them the tools that they need in order to find solutions and solve those local resource conflicts.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. So thank you everyone, panelists, dear panelists, and thank you so much, audience, for your questions. It was extremely interesting discussion that we tried really to dig a bit deeper into climate and conflict nexus. So I think that now we are having a small coffee break, and then we will move forward to the closing fourth panel for this first day of the conference. So thank you so much once again.